The Amazing Spider-Man, one of the most iconic characters ever created, up there with Superman and Batman as one of the most recognizable superheroes on the planet, and Marvel's most consistent mascot, even when all the others like X-Men, Hulk, Fantastic Four, and Avengers have varying degrees of popularity depending on the decade. And like many other superheroes, he's been adapted in a number of different mediums like movies, shows, games, Broadway musicals, all over the place. So I want to explore Spider-Man as a character and what it means to adapt him. This is a topic discussed pretty frequently by many different people, having all kinds of ideas of what the character means to them, and we've seen this come up with many different Spider-Man adaptations in the past couple years with versions like the Insomniac games and especially the MCU movies. So we are going to talk about MCU Spider-Man and how relevant adaptation even is when thinking about the quality of a piece of art. So to lay the groundwork, Spider-Man, you know him, you love him, first showing up in Amazing Fantasy 15 way back in 1962, in a story about a 15-year-old Peter Parker created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. A year later, he got his own series that would follow Peter, living his life, navigating school, relationships, and fighting crime as Spider-Man. He cared for his Aunt May, dealt with people like Flash, Liz, Jonah, and Betty in his early days, and as he transitioned to college, spent more time with the likes of Gwen, MJ, Harry, all while fighting villains from Doc Ock, Green Goblin, Scorpion, and Kraven, to Mysterio, the Grizzly, the Chameleon, the Living Brain, the Big Man, much more. And the series is still going to this day, with multiple relaunches and decades of stories along the way. Some great, some awful. Most people know the origin from Amazing Fantasy 15, where Peter is just your average kid. He's pretty socially ostracized at school, he's made fun of, he has no chance with the girls, but he's cared for by his very loving aunt and uncle. He gets the spider powers, creates a costume, some web shooters, he makes money from a wrestling match and TV gig, and after becoming very arrogant and very selfish and feeling like he doesn't owe the world anything anymore, Peter lets a robber at the TV station get away. Of course, the robber kills his Uncle Ben, and as the narrator puts it, Peter learns the important lesson that with great power, there must also come great responsibility. And the rest is history. As the next couple of decades passed, Spider-Man went on to be the subject of multiple animated series, live-action shows, and James Cameron even wrote a screenplay for a Spider-Man film in the 90s that never saw the light of day. Marvel sells his film rights to Sony, and we get the Sam Raimi trilogy in the early 2000s, Mark Webb's duology of Amazing Spider-Man films in the early 2010s, and finally the recent John Watts MCU trilogy produced in partnership with Disney. And Sony is also making their animated Spider-Verse films, and of course their stupid solo films like Venom, Madam Web, and Morbius. So that being said, what is it about the character of Spider-Man that works? What makes him stand out among the trove of superheroes that exist? I feel like most fans will have a similar answer for this, or at least hit on some similar points. But the most broad and basic is the fact that you truly care about this guy because most elements of his life are very relatable, down to earth, and interesting. It's him having to worry about his aunt being safe, how he's going to pay his rent, how he's going to maintain his friendships and romantic relationships, all while having to be ready to drop everything at a moment's notice and be Spider-Man. It's him learning how to use his abilities in a responsible way. He could obviously better his life as Peter with his powers, but he doesn't because it's not the right and responsible thing to do. And Peter has a clear moral compass he lives his life by. He's one of the big superheroes along with Batman that has a strict no-kill rule, and he just tries his best to live his life by this and help people, all while balancing that with the personal Peter Parker life. And of course, that is the biggest thing. He has to keep his two lives separate when they are constantly at odds with each other and affecting each other. A common idea people like to say is, a loss for Spider-Man is a win for Peter Parker and vice versa. That's a bit reductive and I don't love that saying, but you get the idea. It's very difficult for someone to maintain not only their composure, but a level of quality in each of their lives when they're constantly at odds with each other, and this is such a big component. The Peter Parker drama is of course a defining aspect of the character. If you read the first 200 issues or so of Amazing Spider-Man, the panels of Peter and his supporting cast interacting are by far the more interesting parts of those stories compared to Spidey's fights. Don't get me wrong, a lot of the villains are great, and Spidey quipping and fighting them has some really fun parts and good, meaningful drama, but Stan Lee and the other writers that came after him just did such a good job building a compelling, distinct group of people around him. And Spider-Man himself is a hero that despite his situation tries to do the right thing. When he gets knocked down, he'll always get back up. That's not to say he's not also a very flawed person either though, because like everyone, Peter has his limits and he can be pushed to them and make mistakes. He can lash out at his friends, he can lash out at Aunt May, he can make mistakes fighting crime as Spider-Man, he can succumb to addiction even. He's a flawed person that, like anyone, is constantly growing. And that's not to say he should always be miserable or should never get wins. He should, and throughout time, grow and start to get his life together, but still have ups and downs like everyone does. Even with him not being miserable all the time, there should still be drama, there should be personal stakes for Peter's life and his relationships. There should be consequences not only for Spider-Man's actions, but for Peter's social life. Peter as a person is nice, but he's not submissive.
I'll finish this mission myself.
I'm sick of hearing about you and your mission. It's not like any of your brilliant weapons and schemes have worked.
He learns to become more confident and stand up for himself after he gets his powers. He starts out a little immature and has an attitude at first, right after the spider bite, but throughout high school grows out of it into a more well-rounded, confident, and mature young adult. He's more of a loner at first, but grows more open to working with other heroes and is eventually really respected by nearly every superhero in the Marvel Universe. He gets up and puts that Spider-Man suit on every day because he's been gifted power and he knows he's obligated to use that power in a responsible way after clearly and personally feeling the consequences of this not being done. Ben doesn't have to be mentioned every single day or every single issue or every single episode, but he has a presence in the back of Peter's mind always, and he serves as a constant reminder of why he does what he does. To me, that's what comes to mind when someone says Spider-Man, and I know many other people would say a similar thing or at least broadly agree. Now of course, parts of the Spider-Man character are highlighted and dimmed down depending on the story and adaptation, which of course brings in the question of how do you even adapt a character while changing things needed for the adaptation, but also while keeping the core and identity of the character intact. Just looking at the 3 live-action movie versions of Peter, Tobey Maguire's Peter is a bit more naturally kind-hearted and a bit more of a genuine dork. Andrew's Peter is a little bit more rugged, still socially awkward to an extent, but has some attitude and snark to him, especially when in costume. And Tom is presented as a more naive, wide-eyed Peter who is more beholden to the world around him and the beings around him, all taking place in the MCU. And there's validity to each of these interpretations, and they all pull stuff from the original source of the character, but also places like the cartoons and the Ultimate Comics. There are plenty of Spider-Man adaptations that change things to best fit the story they're telling, and you can do this in a way that keeps the core of the character intact. The 90s show obviously changed the Black Suit saga in a pretty big way that has now become the mold for that story. Spectacular made Norman Osborn a more composed and sane but legitimately evil person as opposed to the kind of split personality Goblin dynamic. The Amazing Spider-Man made Gwen work at Oscorp and gave her a bit more of a personality and a bit more agency than the original character. And I guess as a blanket statement, before we start diving into some specifics, obviously something being quote-unquote comic accurate doesn't determine the quality of the adaptation itself, and this applies to book adaptations or game adaptations or whatever. The feelings that many people have about adaptations are totally valid, and the discussions about how adaptations handle these comic book characters are really interesting ones to have, but overall, I think generally it's more about the art itself that was created and how the changes they make serve the story. People can obviously prefer different adaptations because they lean into different aspects of the original character or of the original story. For example, I know many people don't love the Dark Knight trilogy because of its portrayal of Batman and Gotham, which I totally get. In terms of bringing that certain tone of Batman's world and atmosphere to the screen, Matt Reeves' The Batman was able to do that in a much better way. Nolan's Chicago-style Gotham works perfectly fine for the grounded drama he was telling, but in adapting Gotham like that, you're certainly losing something. You're losing storytelling potential where The Batman was able to capitalize on that in the first 5 minutes of that movie, where Gotham has a distinct visual identity. It plays into the criminal's very palpable fears of Batman. We're able to take in the atmosphere of the city instantly and understand how Batman is currently viewed in Gotham, which in itself establishes Bruce's character and gives a great starting place for his arc in that movie. So as a whole, I think it depends on the situation. And like I said, those are certainly really fascinating conversations to have, but adaptation certainly isn't everything. Another recent example is Todd Phillips' Joker films, which certainly has been making the rounds lately due to the sequel coming out and not being too great. Now, I'm going to be talking about the first movie specifically here, but does Arthur Fleck embody many of the traits that comic book or animated series Joker has that make him very unique? No, but that doesn't stop Joker from being a good movie. I do think there's a question to be asked about how much you change about the character before you've lost the reason you're even adapting them in the first place, and that's a hard line to draw. If the characters' names and locations in Joker were changed to not resemble the comics at all, would that really change anything in the film? Not really. You would still have a pretty interesting and well done character study about a guy who gets shafted by the world and tries to take control of his own life and express himself in all the worst ways possible. But these studios, and in this case maybe Todd Phillips, use the IP to get butts in seats or to get a screenplay approved, and Joker was the first R-rated movie to make $1 billion. And still, I do think there is something kind of cool in that Joker film about seeing a version of the character like that. It's very different than how the character is normally portrayed, and again, it helps that it's a good story. Jared Leto's Joker was also very different, and that was horrible both times he was on screen.
You don't want no beef? You don't want no beef?
How she suffered so.
A cringe performance, bad costume design, really bad writing. I honestly don't know which time was worse when it came to that. So it just depends. And in the MCU Spider-Man films, for example, does Ned Leeds being a completely different character in every way possible really matter? No, because they're clearly not trying to adapt Ned Leeds. They're trying to adapt Genki, kind of, or at least take pretty clear inspiration from him. Another recent example that comes to mind is Paramount's Halo TV show. That show is made up of some dodgy CG work, weak characters, and some of the most nonsensical writing I've seen in a long time. And that's by itself, as a show, as a piece of art. As an adaptation, holy Christ. The fall of Reach and Halo CE were butchered in a way few things ever have been. And you can go through every single change and way they adapted parts of the Halo story and lore, and break down why the show's version is worse than the source material. Jimmy Rings in the show is a pretty annoying and bland character on his own. However, you can dissect and make arguments for why his characterization in the games and books is much more interesting and fitting of the Halo story. So anyways, interesting discussion for sure, and people love to talk about how Spider-Man and his stories have been adapted because it's happened so many times. So let's talk about it in terms of Spider-Man's most recent and one of his more controversial adaptations, being in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I remember waking up for school in 2015 and seeing YouTube videos discussing the news that Spider-Man would finally be joining the MCU, a dream come true for someone like me who grew up watching and reading Spider-Man interact with a huge array of different Marvel characters in shows, comics, and games. I watched all those fan-made Ultimate Alliance movie trailers of Spider-Man teaming up with the 2000s Fantastic Four and the 2000s Daredevil back when I was younger, so in 2015 the timing of this was just perfect. I remember watching the trailer in my high school freshman year Spanish class and just freaking out over the first look at Spider-Man and the moving lenses. All that to say, I was ecstatic, and the whole world was, which I feel like we almost take for granted now, was just how awesome it was that Spider-Man was finally going to get to interact with the Avengers and these characters and actors that were on top of the world at the time. So Civil War comes out and it's very good, easily one of my favorite MCU films and one of their best, for a plethora of reasons, mainly being the character writing and how this film, arguably more than even Infinity War or Endgame, really takes advantage of the storytelling structure of the MCU, where Steve and Tony both have these almost opposing arcs that clearly span from their origin movies to the first Avengers to their next solo movie to Age of Ultron to Civil War. It's got some great action, really great performances, and still the best version of Black Panther we have ever gotten. But let's talk about Spider-Man. He's not in this film much, which is fine, but he's introduced here, and like many people, I loved him when it came out, and I still really appreciate how this film treats Peter. When we meet him, Tony shows up at May's apartment to recruit Peter to help him bring in Captain America and the other Avengers that refuse to sign the Accords. And there are some things about Peter that are made pretty clear. He's not financially very well off. He's a dumpster diver, he's got older technology, he's building computers. The first thing he asks about the Stark internship is if it's paid. He's living with Aunt May, who is a little bit younger than she traditionally is. He's been doing the Spider-Man thing for about 6 months. and I really like the way Tom Holland plays it. He's clearly a little all over the place and razzled by Tony being here, exposing a secret in a sense, but he's not sucking up to Tony. You get the impression he wants to impress Tony and he respects him, but he's not fawning over him. He butts back on him a little bit, he webs his hand to the door. He plays the character in a fairly confident and independent way. He explains to Tony why he does what he does with his little abridged version of the "with great power comes great responsibility" lesson.
Look, when you can do the things that I can, but you don't, and then the bad things happen, they happen because of you.
There's clearly been some event in his life that motivated him to feel this way. I don't think anyone can deny that. And when this movie came out, we were all happy with this because it was clearly implying the origin and motivation for the character in a way that worked for his very small appearance in this film. A lot of people at the time at least somewhat knew the story behind Spider-Man, so at the time, we didn't need to see it again. I think his little explanation here works well, and again was enough for this movie where he's a very, very minor character. And during the airport fight too, I think he's great. He reacts how a teenager would to these events, and he's got some funny lines. I also like that his strength is pretty evident. He's clearly inexperienced, but it's shown that he's very competent. He beats Falcon and Bucky, and I love the shot of him throwing the car at them too. Again, he cares about what Tony thinks of him in this fight, but I think it's a decent balance of him feeling this way and being his own hero. Also, he just feels like he has a bit more edge and attitude and competency to him. Even small things like after Scott turns big.
Holy shit!
That's a great moment, and I think the only time, or one of the only times, that he curses in this series. So yeah, Peter proves his spirit and determination in the fight, and that's that. Super cool, a solid introduction to this version of Spider-Man. A year later, we get Spider-Man Homecoming, and I like this movie. It's definitely grown on me the past couple years, and although I do have my issues, I think it serves as a pretty solid Spider-Man film. It follows Peter after Civil War, living his life in New York, and eagerly awaiting on his chance to work with the Avengers again. And there's a lot of good things about this movie. I think the best way to go through it would just be by character. Starting with Peter, I both like and dislike how he's characterized in this film. From a broad point of view, I am okay with the idea of Peter's arc in this movie. You've got the first Spider-Man film ever taking place in a shared Marvel universe. It makes sense to take advantage of that. I am okay with having the Avengers and the larger Marvel universe play a role in the arc of this Spider-Man, especially in his first film, because it makes sense. I think that it's in line that a 15-year-old kid growing up in this world that saw Iron Man on the news when he was super young, he gets powers, and I think it makes sense that he grows up, and especially after being exposed to the Avengers in Civil War, he's excited. He wants to work with the Avengers and the big heroes and be seen as a legitimate superhero that can handle bigger threats than just what's in the neighborhood. And the basic premise of his arc of learning to slow down, be a kid, appreciate the value in helping the little guy, and of being a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. I am down with that. And generally, I think this film pulls off that arc in a pretty logical and well-informed way. In the first act, Peter constantly texts Happy, he thinks he's ready for bigger things, and just wants to take on larger threats. And when he starts to uncover alien-powered weapons being created and sold by the Vulture, he views this as his chance to really prove himself and protect the neighborhood. He tells Tony about it, and then really drops the ball when trying to take down Vulture on the ferry. So then Tony takes the suit away, and Peter has to defeat Vulture with just his homemade costume and no help from anyone, really other than Ned. And one of his big moments is the classic lifting the rubble, if this be my destiny moment, that this film adapts in a way that is supposed to be used as Peter gaining self-confidence and truly embracing that he is Spider-Man. Not the suit, not his connection to the Avengers or to Tony, he's got a better sense of identity after this. And after fighting Vulture and gaining a better understanding of why someone needs to look out for the little guy, he declines Tony's offer to become an Avenger and don the Iron Spider suit. So again, I think the arc in broad strokes generally works. Now, I know an issue a lot of people have is the idea that Peter would even need to go through this arc in the first place. And I completely understand this sentiment of going into a Spider-Man movie and being pretty disappointed when for most of the runtime, Spider-Man is portrayed the way he is here, where he's pretty amateurish in his abilities as Spider-Man. He almost falls over a lot, he destroys a bunch of property when he's trying to swing in the suburbs. He smacks his head in a truck and gets locked in a facility. He can't interrogate someone without it being a joke. He's someone who's constantly trying to impress and prove himself to the Avengers, and his arc is centered around discovering he doesn't have to do this. And I'm not saying it doesn't make sense, and you can have comedy come from a movie where Spider-Man is pretty inexperienced and makes mistakes. I just think this film, and really whole trilogy, goes a bit too far in that direction sometimes, especially after Civil War, where again, he was fairly confident in his abilities and fighting skill. We'll talk more about this as the trilogy goes along, but I'm totally down with the idea of a movie where Spider-Man learns to be a better, more traditional version of the character. But I feel that idea doesn't flow super well for the character throughout this trilogy. And a lot of people are disappointed with this version of Spider-Man as he's portrayed in this film because he is missing what a lot of people like about the character. The financial issues implied in Civil War are just gone now, never brought up once. And it wouldn't really make sense now because he has an established connection with Iron Man. He has a techie suit made by Tony Stark with a bunch of different gadgets, which is the point. It's supposed to be antithetical to what Spider-Man learns he should be, and he does lose it at the low point. But again, for most of the first Spider-Man film in this universe, very early in Peter's career, he has a tech-based suit that makes him rely less on his natural abilities and skill. A lot of this is personal preference, but yeah, I do prefer my Spider-Man have a traditional suit that rips and doesn't really offer much protection. I like Spider-Man having web shooters, web tracers, his spider signal, just fairly basic equipment. As he grows older and improves his tech, sure, start working some small kind of web-based gadgets in there that make sense, but I'm not huge on the techie suit and tons of crazy gadgets for a young, grounded, neighborhood Spider-Man. Because I just think it works a little bit better for Spider-Man to be a grounded hero of the people, not having this crazy technology provided to him by a billionaire that he knows. I think it creates a bit of a disconnect between him and the everyday New Yorkers he's protecting. Speaking of his relationship with Tony, I do like it in this universe generally. Tom Holland and RDJ have some great chemistry together, and because they do have such a tight relationship, it makes moments like him getting snapped and reacting to Tony's death very hard-hitting emotional beats. But I do wish the relationship, especially here, was portrayed as one of more mutual respect and not as much of adoration. The argument they have after the ferry is a good scene, but I feel like there needs to be more of a discussion about a couple of things. One, I think it's kind of odd that they don't ever really address the fact that Tony recruited Peter to fight in Civil War without really telling him any of the details. He took this pretty impressionable, excited 15-year-old kid and got him to fight Captain America, only really telling him that they're wrong and they think they're right. He does bring it up during their argument for like a split second, but it doesn't go anywhere. There's a lot of potential for maybe a little bit of strife in the relationship where Peter could question Tony on recruiting him, or maybe the Vulture has a modicum of a point when it comes to the little guys being forgotten, which Peter does seem to recognize to an extent by the end of the film, but he never really calls Tony out on it. Not to say Tony's doing anything explicitly wrong here, or is someone that doesn't care about the little guy or the smaller threats, because we know that he does. He calls the FBI on the Vulture, and that's in character for Tony, but maybe he hasn't fully considered how the little guys are feeling the consequences of the Avengers being essentially government sanctioned now that the Accords are a thing. Or how even though Tony supports the Accords and is trying to take responsibility, there is still work to be done when people like Toombs are getting screwed over. I guess just a little bit more thematically on this side of the story when it comes to Tony would have been nice. And while I love the idea of Peter thinking about this stuff more after his confrontation with Vulture, it's not really explored at all in terms of Peter's character and what he thinks about the little guy, the everyman getting screwed over by the bigwigs in charge. There's almost something there, but again, this film really doesn't dive into any of those ideas. Not that it has to per se, but these are themes and ideas that it's playing with through the character of Vulture and how he informs Peter's arc. It's a bit weird to have Spider-Man be a hero of the neighborhood defending the little guy, but also really admire and constantly look up to Tony Stark without at least having some of these conversations with him, or somewhat exploring these ideas a little bit deeper. Spider-Man being a street-level superhero is a great avenue to dive into these themes a little more. But generally, I think Peter's arc works, And for a first movie, I am cool with his character being like this, because it got us to a Spider-Man that in the sequel would hopefully be a bit more traditional, a bit more competent, and not have an arc as focused around the Avengers or Tony. Let's also talk about the rest of the supporting cast, which is mainly Ned, MJ, Flash, and Liz. There's not much to say for Ned. He's Peter's best friend, his guy in the chair. They have a clearly established friendship, on-screen chemistry, and he's pretty funny. MJ, also not much to say. She might have the name MJ, but now it stands for Michelle Jones. And there's not much depth to her character here. She has a very dry sense of humor, very sarcastic, very weird, and I like her. Zendaya plays it in a fun way. She doesn't really do anything in the story, but she's there. And it's hinted at throughout the film, and especially the end, that she's probably interested in Peter. She's kind of fascinated by him always disappearing, and maybe she's got some feelings for him. No real issues there either. Mainly set up for the future. Liz also is pretty nothing, and in this film she really is just Peter's crush. She's a girl at school with a normal personality and no real distinct character traits. And again, for this story and being the high school crush for Spider-Man, she's fine. Of course, there's an interesting dynamic with Vulture being her father, and that is probably the best stuff in the movie. Adrian Toomes is great here. A legitimately surprising, well-implemented twist when Peter opens the door and is faced with his enemy. And it's been gushed on a lot, but the car scene is also very good. Such a fun watch as Toomes slowly figures out Peter's identity with the traffic light reflecting that. Michael Keaton kills it, and we can also talk about his character a little more because he's perfect. Making Adrian Toomes a Vulture who scavenges on the remains of the MCU battles and characters and makes his own living with it, it's awesome. This is how you adapt a character into your universe in a fitting way. Such a great idea. And it's pretty compelling watching a relatively normal guy who just wants to steal stuff and commit pretty petty crimes to pay for his wife and daughter to live. And that's it. He's not out for blood, he doesn't want to kill or really hurt anybody, but he will if you get in his way. And with the exception of the stupid scene where he nonchalantly kills the first Shocker and he's like, "Oh, I didn't mean to do that, whoops."
I thought this was the anti-gravity gun.
What? No, that's that one.
Other than that, he's a somewhat reasonable guy who is just committing these crimes because he feels like he has to survive. He's fighting back against the big wigs that he feels screwed him over, and that makes for a very compelling antagonist. In terms of consequences that happen because of Peter's actions in this film, I also like that Liz is a very direct result of them. Peter did the responsible thing and took out Vulture, but in doing so he lost his chance at a relationship with Liz. That's a solid Peter Parker consequence for a Spider-Man action. It's not that meaningful or impactful because Liz is a pretty nothing character, and her relationship with Peter was nothing more than a high school crush we didn't see much of, but the idea is right, and I like that it's at least in this film. Other than that, I feel like this movie kind of misses the mark on the high school cast and Peter's relationship with them. When Peter misses the decathlon due to Spider-Man stuff, they win anyways, and Peter is welcomed back instantly, which they play off as a joke.
Yeah, I was hoping maybe I could rejoin the team.
No way. You can't just quit on us, stroll up, and be welcomed back by everyone.
Hey, welcome back, Peter. Flash, you're back to first alternate.
What?
Instead of, Peter's relationships actually being strained due to his Spider-Man activity. A really good example of this idea being adapted is early in Spectacular Spider-Man, where Peter is fired from his internship at the science lab because Martha Connors thinks he abandoned her and Kurt when he transforms into the Lizard. It looks like Peter ditched them to go take pictures for the Bugle and make some money, when in reality he actually went to go save Connors as Spider-Man. And yeah, he did take some pictures too, which wasn't really cool, but he needs the money to help his aunt. It's an impossible situation, and this completely changes his relationship with Eddie and the Connors for the rest of the show. Again, that's not necessary to make a good movie, but this idea is a pretty important part of the Spider-Man character. Or kicking Spider-Man 2 off with Peter getting fired from the pizza shop because he can't consistently make deliveries on time. In Homecoming, even when, say, Peter leaves Ned at the party, there's not really a discussion or any strife about Peter doing this. Ned has one line.
Hey, thanks for bailing on me.
Yeah, well, something came up.
Oh, what is that?
Then that's it. That's fine if you don't want to have any relationship drama with Ned and Peter, but that's a prime example of a time where it would be perfectly in line and reasonable if he was a little annoyed at Peter for ditching him and feels like he isn't valuing their friendship enough. I do think there's some good, very Spider-Man-esque moments that almost embody this, like Peter having to leave the party and the hotel room in DC, where he takes a second to take in the small sacrifices that he has to make to be Spider-Man. But these are few and far between. And generally, these movies seem adverse to having Peter's social life really feel the consequences of his Spider-Man activity. In terms of others in the high school cast, Betty's there, she's nothing, but that's fine, and there's Flash, who in this movie serves as a bully and slightly antagonistic force to Peter, but his character in this whole trilogy is pretty mishandled, partly because of the quote-unquote bullying that Flash does. I do like the idea of updating Flash to be a bit more modern and not necessarily a solely physical cliche kind of bully from the 60s, but in doing that, they also kind of got rid of a lot of the purpose that Flash serves as a character, because he's not much of a threat to Peter in any regard now. In fact, Flash comes across as just a rich, complete loser who yells things like Penis Parker and occasionally makes fun of him, but Peter doesn't care. The closest they get is probably the party scene, where Flash has a room of people chanting Penis Parker. But like, come on. Flash here is just a complete dweeb with no character traits other than he bullies Peter by yelling middle school insults. Why not have him actually insult and bully Peter over meaningful things that matter to him, like his aunt or home life, and Peter gets upset with him or it gets under his skin? You don't have to have Flash be a physical threat to have him be interesting and serve that antagonist role well. He can even act in passive-aggressive ways, like walking past Peter and knocking him in the shoulder. Then he's not trying to punch him in the face, but it still tempts Peter with him now being so physically capable with his spider powers. I've always viewed Flash Thompson as a worthwhile Spider-Man character because at the beginning, he functions as a constant test of Peter's great power and great responsibility. Every day Peter is bullied by Flash, who he can physically overpower without breaking a sweat, but he chooses not to because that's not a responsible use of his power. There's also the element of Flash being a character in his own right, one that throughout high school and mainly in college grows to be a much better person and good friend of Peter's that enlists in the army. This is something that the TASM movies, for as little as he was on screen, still attempted to do, and that's appreciated. It doesn't have to be a lot, but they don't even try here. Flash is barely anything in this movie, and it only gets worse as the trilogy goes along. And is the character of Flash in Homecoming a flaw of the movie? No, I wouldn't say so, but this is an example of adaptation and changing things for the worse. You're adapting a supporting character who is important to Spider-Man, who has tons of incarnations in different books, shows, and movies, and you're missing multiple elements of what makes the character work and be a worthy addition to the Spider-Man mythos. In fact, I'd say you're missing the defining elements of Flash as a character. This is their take on adapting Flash Thompson, and it's understandable why so many people have issues with it. They wasted Tony Revolori with some pretty weak scripts when it came to his character, which just sucks to see, because as an actor, I do really like him. And there's Aunt May, who I think is pretty good in this movie. Her and Peter's relationship is built on from what we saw in Civil War, and I think there's just enough of it in this story. It's written well enough, whether it's scenes of them at dinner, or Peter discussing how he can't tell May after everything she's been through in the past year, or her confronting him after he loses the suit and showing a more stern parental side of her personality. And the sequence with her helping Peter get ready for Homecoming is a lot of fun. I really do like Marissa Tomei as this character. Very, very good casting in my opinion. She can be funny, she can be assertive, caring, just a wonderful choice all around for a younger Aunt May, which again is an adaptation choice that I like, and how you change things to fit what you're doing. I don't want to see a version of Aunt May that is 100% authentic to the original probably ever on screen, because that would be really annoying. She'd constantly be on death's door, she'd be really stupid when it comes to the morality of people like Spider-Man and like Doc Ock, and just constantly be a huge hindrance on Peter to a ridiculous degree. As long as Aunt May is a caring, lovable, morally good person that cares for her nephew, I think that's enough. A little bit of time spent on her grieving Ben is nice, and yeah, you can have her slightly older if you want to introduce more health-related issues, but I don't think it's completely necessary. Just like I don't think financial issues with her are 100% necessary, but they are interesting and provide a lot of dramatic potential with the character. And if that potential drama isn't replaced with something better, then you start to question why things weren't adapted in a certain way to start with. Regardless, Homecoming does a good job of establishing May's character from what we saw in Civil War and her relationship with Peter. And at the end, she discovers that Peter is Spider-Man, which of course we'll talk about even if the next movie won't. Spider-Man's relationship with New York is a pretty big part of the character as well, and this is something that the previous incarnations in film really hit on. The Raimi movie had its cheesy post-9/11 citizens uniting and helping Spider-Man, and the great moment in Spider-Man 2 where he's saved by the people on the train and they agree to keep his secret. Plus there's the little cutaways to the wacky people of New York and their take on Spider-Man when he first shows up.
Some kind of freaky Lou or something. Wackadoo.
And even TASM tried a similar idea that in execution was a little silly, but very sincere, and hit home the idea of Spider-Man being a hero of the everyman, like the crane operators and construction workers of the city. Good stuff. And this movie has a little montage of Peter helping people around New York, which I like, but like a lot of stuff in this trilogy, it's presented a little bit more comedically than empowering. The goal of the montage is to show Peter's eagerness and drive to help the people of New York, which fits the story, but we never really see much of Spider-Man's relationship with New York and its citizens after this. The rest of the trilogy doesn't really capitalize on the things this movie set up, especially when No Way Home kinda tried to. It works for this movie, but again, this is me recognizing that this part of the character is hinted at here and never again in this trilogy. I also want to hit on some production stuff, because although writing is very, very important in film, obviously, it's not everything. And cinematography, lighting, VFX, all that stuff matters as well. And I'm not breaking new ground by saying these movies don't look very good. Generally speaking, there are of course a few shots that are exceptions. And most of the MCU, going way back, looked fine until Phase 4. There was some bad green screen here and there, some fake looking CG every once in a while, but for the most part, the movies looked pretty good. It was pretty impressive what they were doing, especially with the early films like Iron Man and Incredible Hulk. Iron Man's the obvious example that everyone goes to, but he never looked as real or as lifelike as he did in Phase 1 for the rest of his appearances. The small attention to details like the reflections and especially sound design was a huge one that kind of stuff just began to get lost as the universe went on and the Marvel machine had to keep pumping out more and more movies. But I remember even when this movie came out, people talked about Spidey not looking too great. Not suit-wise, because I do really like the design of the Stark suit, and especially the homemade one, which in itself is just a really neat take on the homemade costume idea with the goggles that is genuinely new and super cool. But watching an obviously rubbery CGI Spider-Man jumping around rooftops is really disappointing. And I think the main problem is that there's just no wrinkles of any kind on the suit for some reason. It just looks like there's no real texture or tangibility to it. So I'd say like 90-95% of the time Spider-Man is on screen in the Stark suit in this movie, it looks fake, which sucks. But when he puts on the homemade suit, it looks good. And most of the other CG in this movie like Vulture and Iron Man all looks pretty normal too. It's just Spider-Man himself, but that is a big problem when he's the title character. And unfortunately, this doesn't really improve too much with the next two movies. And just like most of the MCU films, this movie doesn't have much visually interesting going on. It's shot in a very standard way, there's no real attention put into how the camera is being moved. The action in this film is also generally pretty weak, definitely the weakest in the trilogy. It's all pretty basic Spider-Man punching, thugs, some kicking, nothing too crazy. All that stuff is fine for what it is. And the final fight with the Vulture is also very whatever, but just not very interesting. I've never thought that Vulture offered much action potential as a villain, since he just flies and can stab you with his wings maybe. So some versions give him like projectiles and stuff like that, but the final fight in Homecoming is fairly mediocre. It's dark, it's just not super exciting to watch, and action is certainly not one of this movie's strengths. Visually, Homecoming overall is just a very, very bland and sometimes bad experience. And on its own, this would just be a normal, yeah, not great visual effects, whatever kind of situation. But a lot of people get hung up on it for this trilogy because Spider-Man has already had not one, but two on-screen adaptations that look leagues better than this film and most of this trilogy. And one of those was directed by Sam Raimi, who just so happens to be one of the most visually distinct filmmakers out there. I'm not saying that every film needs to have an incredibly distinct style or aesthetic. You do what you need to do to service the storytelling and the characters. But yeah, obviously the MCU Spider-Man trilogy stands out when Raimi's movies are such a visual feast, where besides a few single moments of dated CG, Spider-Man looks amazing, practically lifelike. Those movies have a very distinct golden hour aesthetic to them that gives them their own personality, their own recognizability. They're shockingly great CG models that are 20 years old by this point. I don't want to dive too deep into the Raimi movies, but they are just so well shot, so creatively edited, and the swinging looks great. It has this sense of grandiosity and majesty to it that embodies the heroism of Spider-Man. And the swinging in Mark Webb's TASM movies is also great. They established their own identity with their own web swinging that was very reflective of Andrew Spider-Man, that was a bit more emotive through his physicality and through his attitude. You can create exciting and empowering web swinging scenes without just copying Raimi or stuff that's come before. Even the Insomniac games have been able to do this to an extent, but this movie especially doesn't even try, and we don't get a glimpse of this kind of thing being implemented until the end of the next film and a little in No Way Home. And yeah, that means there's not really a dedicated web swinging scene in this movie, which combined with a lot of the other production elements just make it feel a lot less impressive than what's come before in terms of Spidey. The Spider-Man in this film on a surface level is just a lot less cool than the other ones when we don't get to be amazed at watching him swing through the city. I know that's not what they're going for here. They're going for more of a fun, goofy, kind of naive, childlike Spider-Man that bounces around, and yeah, that's what we get in the montage. And we'll talk more about that in Far From Home, but production-wise, this movie doesn't look great, and I definitely think it's the worst in the trilogy in terms of the CGI on Spider-Man himself. There are a couple of other random things I want to bring up in Homecoming. I really like Donald Glover for his brief time here. He's just a fun performer that made a very minuscule character somewhat memorable, and it would have made a lot of sense if he was a recurring character throughout this trilogy. But alas, that didn't happen. I also still think this is one of the funnier MCU films, a pretty good sense of comedic timing throughout, and some jokes that I think still land years later. I remember the first time I saw this in theaters in 2017, that looking at porn line from Ned really got me laughing, and this I still think is a pretty solid comedic movie. The video diary idea for the intro is fun and already pretty informative of Peter's character like 10-20 seconds into the film. Again, an idea I kind of wish they'd stuck with in the future. Everybody brings this up, but it's crazy that Scorpion never gets addressed again, especially with the post-credits scene. I love this cut right here when Vulture is introduced, very intimidating. It's one of the only moments where it feels like some love was put into the editing. I also like the Vulture theme, and generally I'm fine with Michael Giacchino's Spider-Man scores, but I feel it's not until No Way Home that the music really delivered more of what I was looking for. And I think that's all my rambling on Spider-Man Homecoming. A solid movie that introduces this version of Spider-Man pretty well in his first solo story. Vulture is great, and this film does have some decent character stuff going for it with Peter. It did adapt some things in a very weird way, but it's only the first movie. Characters can grow, relationships can evolve, and even with some of my issues, I can't deny that this movie is still solid. And looking back on it, it's definitely the one in the trilogy with the least amount of problems, easily. Lucky for Homecoming, the next two movies decided to throw logic out the window when it came to their plots. So that is going to do it. Moving on. Spider-Man Far From Home. This is the one, an incredibly divisive movie that every week you'll find someone complaining about, and also someone saying it's overhated. And this was really the point where MCU Spider-Man and him as an adaptation really started generating some discussion. And I fall on the negative side. This is not a good movie, unfortunately, in most aspects. There's a very, very few things to appreciate and compliment, but for the most part, I find this to be a pretty abysmal screenplay that treats the plot and most of the characters horribly. So let's go over exactly why this movie isn't very good. I think before diving into Peter in this film, we have to cover what happened between Homecoming and the start of this movie. In Infinity War, Peter shows up to help Tony and Doctor Strange take on Ebony Maw and Cull Obsidian. He ends up going to space with them, taking on the responsibility. He's dubbed an Avenger by Tony, and given the Iron Spider suit. And I have never really viewed this as undercutting his arc in Homecoming, which I know some people do. Him doing this in Infinity War makes sense. It's in character for Peter, and it's good stuff, other than him undercutting this good line of dialogue with a dumb joke.
You can't be a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man if there's no neighborhood. Okay, that didn't really make sense, but you know what I'm trying to say.
I like Peter stepping up and taking on the challenge because that's what he would do. If Earth is in danger, he's gonna step up to defend it and protect his neighborhood and friends and family along with it. And although the Iron Spider suit would go on to be overused and progressively look worse over time, it's cool that he gets an upgrade that he would need to go into space, and it helps distinguish his team-up time from the solo movies. And again, I think we sometimes forget just how exciting it was when Infinity War came out and we got to see Spider-Man with the Guardians and wearing a suit that had only been teased in Homecoming. So yeah, he fights Thanos with the others and is once again presented pretty well, I think, from a combat sense. He gets snapped, shows up at the final battle in Endgame, and is there when Tony dies. So when this film begins, Peter is a little traumatized by the events that have happened, and he wants to chill on being Spider-Man for a little bit. He's going on a vacation with his classmates and just wants to focus on that. Sure, I think that makes sense. Unlike certain Spider-Man fans out there, I don't think it's a huge sin for Peter to take breaks from doing his thing, especially when there are other people out there like Miles in the Insomniac games or the other heroes that are in the MCU, which I know in this movie they say none are around, but I don't really accept that. So I think that part of the setup is fine. Also, Peter's arc in this movie is set up in the beginning where he feels like he has to live up to Iron Man's legacy. Tony's death clearly left an impact on the world, and in his absence, everyone from Nick Fury to the press are all asking Peter if he's gonna be the next Iron Man, if he's gonna step up, if he's gonna fill those giant shoes. And that's enforced throughout the film, where he gets Edith and uses it irresponsibly, he's tricked by Beck, and he constantly has Fury telling him that he's not ready for the responsibility and that Stark chose wrong. Which brings us to our low point on the plane with Happy.
I don't know if that's me, Happy. I'm not Iron Man.
You're not Iron Man. Tony was my best friend. He second-guessed everything he did. He was all over the place. The one thing that he did that he didn't second-guess was picking you.
Peter says, "I'm not Iron Man," and Happy tells him that he doesn't have to live up to Tony and that Tony was a flawed person. And essentially the idea is that Peter learns to be his own hero and trust his instincts. He doesn't have to live up to Iron Man. All that is what his arc is supposed to be. But it is one of the most surface level, nothing character arcs I have ever seen, especially for Spider-Man. First, this arc is too derivative of what's come before. Homecoming was about Peter learning to slow down, protect the neighborhood, and discover what kind of hero he should be as Spider-Man. And in this film, he once again is solidifying that he should be his own hero and forge his own identity as Spider-Man. That's not to say you can't build on what Homecoming did, of course you can. Characters continue to grow and evolve, and it's not like after his first movie Peter is just done growing or anything like that. But it's the fact that Far From Home really doesn't add anything new to his journey. His declaration of being his own hero in this movie doesn't feel any more definitive or substantive than the one at the end of Homecoming. It's also weird that after the last film was about Peter forging his own identity and being his own hero, not having to live up to the size and scope of the Avengers, that's essentially the same premise of his arc in this film. It's wild to me that 2 out of the 3 movies in this Spider-Man trilogy are using his relationship with Iron Man as a way for him to grow as a character. Of course, Iron Man should play a role in him becoming a hero because that's how things were established in Civil War and that made sense at the time, but that's what Homecoming was for. He did that. Tony's dead. Let Spider-Man move on and grow from it. We don't need this entire movie for that arc to happen. There are also much better ways to tie Tony's death into Peter's arc for a second Spider-Man movie. You could have told a story about Peter grieving from Tony's death, and he's constantly Spider-Manning now and fighting crime to try and make up for it because he feels guilty that he couldn't do anything. Maybe he has to learn to balance his Spider-Man and Peter lives, and how that's something Tony would have wanted for him. There are other ways to write an arc for Peter following Homecoming and Endgame that aren't just a retread of what's come before. After Homecoming, we shouldn't need a movie of Peter having to learn that he doesn't need to be the next Iron Man or live up to the legacy of the Avengers, and that he should be his own hero. He knows that by now. It actually comes across more like he's regressed to before Homecoming even happened. And there's just so little to this arc, and the culminating scene of it on the plane is just super thin. Happy says, "Tony was right about picking you," and that's it. Then Peter makes his own suit with the Stark tech on the plane, while AC/DC plays and he mistakes it for Led Zeppelin. And Happy looks back at him with a sense of pride and a fond remembrance of Tony. And I get the idea they're trying to do here is, look, he's forging his own identity as a hero while incorporating Tony and his legacy into that. At least I think that's the idea. Maybe that's giving the writers too much credit. But in execution, it just comes across as his identity as Spider-Man still being so heavily tied to Iron Man and Stark technology. In the scene, he realizes he'll never be Iron Man and doesn't have to live up to him, and then immediately makes a tech-based suit with Iron Man technology with Tony's best friend while Iron Man's music plays. It's super weird. I think there are plenty of better ways you could have pulled off the idea of Spider-Man forging his own identity while remembering Tony. I know people make fun of the idea, I guess, of him turning off AC/DC and playing a song more representative of his identity. And yeah, that sounds a little silly, but that's the right idea, and thematically would have been much more appropriate. He's not forging enough of his own identity here. It's like the screenwriters have this arc for Peter to go through, but they were still too concerned with him having to be connected to the MCU and to Tony that even in his death, he is still central to Peter's arc, the entire plot of this movie, and the culmination of Peter's arc. Peter mistaking Tony's music for Led Zeppelin as a little joke, and then it continues to play in the scene, is not a meaningful way to portray Peter's change in character throughout this film. It's pathetic. The execution of the plane scene comes across as more antithetical to his journey in the film, and that journey, once again, is one he should have never had to go on in the first place after Homecoming. There's also the aspect of his spider sense, which is supposed to be representative of his journey in this film. In the beginning of Far From Home and for most of the runtime, his spider sense isn't working. Then it doesn't come up again until Happy mentions it on the plane, and he tells Peter to get his tingle back online. And then when the moment comes, he relies on it to defeat Mysterio, and it works. And like I said, I think the idea is that it's supposed to be representative of his mental state and his arc in the film, where after he realizes he needs to rely on his instincts and doesn't need to be the next Iron Man, and has more confidence in himself, then his mental state is more clear. His spider sense works now. The idea is something similar to what they did in like Spider-Man 2, but again, in this film, it's just so thin. The spider sense is barely a factor in the story. It comes up 3 times in total, and I think could have been improved by it being something that Peter actually acknowledges throughout the story. In any of the elemental fights, he could have been hit by something and then have a reminder, oh yeah, I don't have my spider sense right now. It could have been meaningfully acknowledged in the plane scene. Also, he barely even used his spider sense in Homecoming, so it's not like it's even a huge part of this character in the solo movie so far. Considering the spider sense is how he defeats the main villain, there just should have been more time spent focusing on it. And it doesn't help that, like we just went over, Peter's arc that this is centered around is extremely weak. For example, I'm going to bring up Spider-Man 2 again. Obviously, it doesn't have to be exactly like the Raimi movies, because I know people will say that. But in terms of writing characters and working thematic elements into Peter's journey, it did this really well, where Spider-Man 1 is the origin and about Peter discovering that with great power comes great responsibility. And in the sequel, it's about Peter learning how to be the hero Spider-Man and balance this with his responsibilities as Peter Parker when it comes to trying to improve his relationship with MJ and coming clean to May about what happened in the first movie. And in that film, Spider-Man defeats Doc Ock by empathizing with him and using what he's learned from May about what it means to be a hero. This is relevant to Otto as a character, and of course, Peter learning the definition of a hero and the sacrifice that comes along with it. It actually builds on and elaborates on what was established in the original movie. Then the third film is about Peter having gone too far in figuring out how to live both lives and thriving, and what it means when he starts to become overconfident and arrogant, and due to that falls into addiction essentially. Each of those movies grows the character in a way that builds off the previous film, but asks a new question, presents a new substantive idea, instead of just being derivative and adding nothing new. Let's also talk about Peter being a complete moron. Again, Peter can and should make mistakes. He is flawed, but this film turns up his incompetence and silliness up to 11. After he gets Edith, which he never should have gotten by the way, I don't understand why Tony left this program that not only has access to the entire Stark global security network, but also a fleet of fully armed killer drones just sitting up in space. He left this to Peter instead of Happy or Pepper or Rhodey. Peter has them, which is dumb, and he accidentally calls in a drone strike on Brad. And people dog on this scene all the time, but it truly is awful. It looks horrible. It has Peter being ridiculously incompetent. He nearly executes this kid in his class with a drone because he accidentally used Edith the wrong way. It's so ridiculous that it's almost funny, which is the idea. This happens because Far From Home is so set on being a carefree summer Disney Channel-esque adventure that it bends every aspect of the writing to this. It doesn't think, hey, this doesn't make a bit of logical sense, or hey, this could be emotionally compelling or interesting drama. No, it wants to play everything for a joke because funny, Spider-Man funny, which is such a waste. One of this Spider-Man's 3 solo movies is nearly a total wash because it wants to have the smallest amount of consequences and drama possible. Spider-Man's suit gets spotted in TSA, isn't that funny? Peter's suitcase with an Easter egg to Ben's initials gets blown up, oh funny, haha, isn't it quirky we call it a spider since the
Peter Tingle.
The Peter Tingle.
Come on, Peter Tingle.
Please do not start calling it my Peter Tingle.
May Parker having to raise a child on her own that she now knows is in constant danger? How would the characters act in this situation? Shouldn't we explore that a little or kind of mine the dramatic potential? I don't care. Isn't she hot? Isn't she funny with Jon Favreau? Oh, funny, haha.
New dress?
Yeah, yes, it is. It's a new beard.
My blip beard. Blip.
Oh, Peter's in his underwear with a Russian lady
Sorry,
and called in a drone strike on Brad. Isn't that absurd? Look, baby mountain goat. Far From Home is allergic to character drama, and the only somewhat meaningful stuff it tries to do is a derivative, watered-down retread of an arc for its main character that was done infinitely better in the previous movie. Being funny and being whimsical is the #1 concern here, and yeah, like I mentioned, all of Peter's goofy and incompetent traits really just get dialed up here. He gives Edith to someone that he literally just met a day or 2 earlier. It doesn't matter that it looks like he's trustworthy or that it appears like he would sacrifice his life. You've seen on the bus what this technology can do, and you actually gave full access to this huge security system to someone you don't know. Peter also doesn't seem to care what anyone thinks about his secret identity either. He wears the Night Monkey suit in what he thinks is a bar full of civilians with Mysterio also in full costume. He's not apprehensive in the slightest when Hill tells him that he can take his mask off in front of all the SHIELD agents. As much as this Peter tries to tell us his secret identity is a huge deal, what we're shown doesn't really support that, which makes the post-credit scene less impactful. We can also talk about a few more plot things. Like I said, I'm cool with Peter wanting to take a break from being Spider-Man for a little. But it's wild to me that he's so dead set on not helping Fury when the threat, as far as he knows, is the entire planet being destroyed. He's told by Beck that the elementals will kill this world just like they did his, and he's like, yeah, but I want to go talk to MJ. Well, you're not going to be able to talk to MJ when the planet's destroyed and you're both dead because you didn't help. This plot hinges on characters being really stupid, and Mysterio's plan is so weird to me, where he already has an army of drones that make Mysterio look like a hero, but he's gonna get Edith from Peter so he can make an even bigger or Avengers level threat, as he says, and be more of a hero. I'm not really sure why he even needs Edith when he already has a bunch of drones and should be able to make more of them. I'm also not sure why he doesn't just shoot Peter right here with the drone instead of running him over with the train. And when looking at film, I'm not one to go super deep usually on examining minute things or criticizing a plot super heavily a lot of the time, just because for me, I don't think that's where the most interesting discussions are most of the time. Plot matters for sure, logical consistency matters, plot holes matter, character consistency matters, but a few things here and there not adding up, especially in genre films like this, has never really been the end of the world for me. You can have a rough plot but good character writing, and I'll still think pretty positively of the movie overall. It only becomes a giant problem for me when the plot is so nonsensical and the characters are so stupid that it's clear there was such a lack of effort put into it. And I've had that happen a few times in the past couple years with movies like Batman v Superman, Rise of Skywalker, and now 2/3 of these Spider-Man movies. At least this film can somewhat get away with making Fury a complete moron, since it is Talos in disguise, but that's also just kinda lame, and it just feels like a workaround that takes away from Fury and what could have been his relationship with Peter in this movie. In lieu of being too negative, let's talk about something good, or the only thing good, being Mysterio. I do generally enjoy watching this character. Jake Gyllenhaal gives a charming, fairly natural performance when we meet Quentin Beck, but when he's able to fully dive into a villain, I really enjoy how much he hams it up. I like the switch up in the reveal scene with his over-the-top performance and all his lackeys hyping him up, and I do like a lot about how Mysterio is shown here, which, just like Homecoming, I think is an example of, for the most part, properly adapting a character in a cool new way. Yes, he's a Stark employee, which I do think is kind of annoying, but I think his personality is on point. Quickly hitting on the Stark thing, like we were just talking about with Peter's arc, it's really lame to have another one of Peter's antagonists be so directly related to Tony. And yes, this does tie into Peter trying to live up to Tony's legacy and now dealing with a consequence of Tony's, but similar to his arc, doing something so similar for the second movie in a row is just repetitive and derivative. There's a balance to paying respect to Tony and involving Iron Man in the plot and characters of these Spider-Man movies, but not going overboard by having so much of these films be about that. There's a sweet spot in there, and this movie is not in it. And because of this, it really comes across like this Spider-Man can't have his own stories and villains without them being related to Tony in some way. By the time this movie's done, we've had 2 solo Spider-Man movies in this universe, and both of them have Peter's arcs focused in some way around the Avengers or Tony, and both of them have the villains be motivated by a scorn for Tony Stark or what he represents, and that's really lame to do for your Spider-Man movies. Other than that aspect of Mysterio, I do like him here. The concept of Mysterio being essentially a film crew, where all these people are working together, you've got a costume department, a writer who comes up with all the cliche generic dialogue he says in battle, you've got the special effects guys, and especially Beck always wearing a mocap suit. That's a genuinely really cool way to adapt the character to film, and I like that part of his characterization. Plus, his actual Mysterio design is picture perfect, and the one real Mysterio action scene we do get is incredible. When everyone said Mysterio should be the villain of a Spider-Man movie, this is what they were imagining. A very comic booky, beautiful looking sequence where Peter can't tell what's real and what isn't, and the illusions are used for inventive and creative visuals that aren't just cool on a monkey brain level to look at, but also reflect what Peter is supposed to be feeling. And there's about 30 seconds of perfect Spider-Man Mysterio action here. And I think all of this is really well done, with Peter constantly getting tricked and not being able to trust anything. Unfortunately, this is where the action peaks in this movie, because the final fight is super underwhelming. Because Spider-Man is just fighting an army of weaponized drones. There is nothing Mysterio about this fight. After the illusion's taken down, which happens very quickly, there is nothing interesting going on here, which again, is just so much wasted potential with Mysterio being your villain. You can do the same payoff of the Spider-Sense moment, but have him be fighting enemies with some spark or imagination or creative visual flair to them. Yeah, Mysterio's illusions are just that, illusions, but he's a theatrical guy. He likes to play up the part and give the illusion of these grand challenges that Spider-Man has to overcome. But this finale is just Spider-Man swinging around and destroying a bunch of white robot drones, and they blow up. This is more Tinker than Mysterio. Why not have him fight the robots disguised as different illusions, or have the drone tech be used to create robotic enemies that make for a more interesting army? It's just such a boring and lame way to use the character of Mysterio for an action scene, and I like how the final Spider-Sense scene looks and the idea of the final illusion where Beck's killed, but it comes after a very, very boring battle. Let's talk about some supporting characters again. The biggest one is probably MJ, who gets a lot more screen time than in Homecoming. And it's because the second this movie starts, after the intro, Peter goes up to Ned with this big plan to win MJ over. Which is crazy because at the end of the last movie, it just seemed like he maybe could be into her at some point in the future, but we skip all of that, and this movie acts like this is something Peter has ever thought about before. Because, oh, isn't it cute seeing Tom Holland and Zendaya together? Oh, they're so awkward and quirky. The jump from the end of Homecoming to how Peter feels in the beginning of this film is the craziest shift ever. These feelings should have been developed more over the course of this movie, where throughout the trip he realizes he kinda likes her and might have feelings for her, and then at the end she can say she feels the same way and do the same kiss and all that stuff. But instead, the second this movie starts, he has this plan to spend the whole trip romantically with her. I think it's a little forced coming after the last movie, but whatever. When they are together, yeah, I think they have good chemistry. They're able to pull off the whole awkward teenagers first kissing and hanging out thing pretty well, but that credit completely goes to the actors as opposed to the writing. And once again, I ask, why not put a little bit of depth and effort into this romance and this relationship? Why is MJ any different to Peter than Liz was? She's just a girl that Peter has a crush on, which is fine, I guess, but there's nothing else to it or to her. And spoilers, there really won't be for the rest of their time together. Again, just as an example, it's at least nice that the relationship between Mary Jane and Peter has something to dig into in the original film. The scene the two of them share outside their houses is effective because it provides a connection between the two that you see forming during the conversation. It's clear that Peter encouraging MJ's dream of acting is the first time she's really heard that. He's the first one that's really supported her dreams, even if it's just a small comment. It's also clear she comes from a broken home, and hearing someone tell her this for the first time, it makes an impact on her. Raimi MJ isn't my dream adaptation of the character or anything, but she has depth. She's a layered character with wants and needs, and the screenplay treats her as an actual person and explores her feelings for Peter. Again, Far From Home is just adamant on not giving its side characters really any depth, and it just wants to be the fun, carefree Disney Channel movie. You could argue there's one line she has.
I don't really have much luck when it comes to getting close to people.
But she says that, and that's it. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't inform her character moving forward. It doesn't inform how the relationship or dialogue between her and Peter is written. It's nothing, because that's easier. They're just two high school kids, and they like each other. Aren't they cute? Oh, she figured out he's Spider-Man? Haha, very fun. Isn't that whimsical? Betty's in this movie more, which I like, and she's fine. I actually find her little summer fling romance thing with Ned kind of funny. That's where I think the high school type humor isn't too overbearing and kind of where I think it should be coming from, and there are some decently funny bits. Would I like anything else to Ned at some point other than just comedy and being Peter's best friend? Yeah, but it's not here, so maybe in the next movie. This version of Flash continues to be nothing. At least here he makes one joke about Peter being poor, but that doesn't really seem to be true now anyways. And they brought in the him being a huge Spider-Man fan thing, but it's not used for anything meaningful with the character. He says it inspires him, but of course it's played for a joke, and now he's even more of a loser than in Homecoming, where he gets punched in the nuts and is still just a really lame character. I will also say I like the teachers, just like in the first film. Mr. Harrington is a fun supporting cast member, and again, where I think the comedic, high school type jokes should be coming from. And there's Brad, the most pointless character who is just there to be an adversary for Peter, getting close to MJ. He's a nothing burger of a person, he never shows up again, he has no real discernible characteristics other than he's trying to get with MJ, and his entire role just could have been filled by Flash. I know it wasn't really set up previously that Flash was interested in MJ like that, but they didn't set up a lot of stuff from the last movie. I don't understand why you would bring in a new antagonistic high school character to add to the cast when Flash is right there. It just plays into everyone else blipping, but he aged 5 years and now he's cute and the girls love him. He is nothing. And there's Aunt May, who after being a convincing, loving parental figure that was actually in the last movie, she's in 4 scenes here, and one of them is a phone call, and she spends most of her screen time doing funny haha rom-com bits with Chef. There's no new layers added to her character. We don't see a different side of her, she doesn't grow. She's at least consistent, I guess, with the very small glimpses of her still caring that Peter isn't dead. That's good. But by far the biggest mistake is how this movie handles the fallout of May discovering Peter is Spider-Man. There's no mention of it, zero, nothing. We don't see the conversation they had. Peter spent all of Homecoming and his time in Civil War making clear how big a deal it is that May never finds out. And she finally does, but it's never acknowledged once. Just like Peter's obsession with MJ, we skip to this film and she's just cool with it. She even packs his suit because she's the cool, fun, hot Aunt May. Forget any dramatic potential the character is capable of. We don't need any of that. There could have been a flashback to the conversation the two of them had, or just literally any acknowledgement whatsoever. Far From Home drops the ball so hard on May as a character, and it sucks because Homecoming did what it had to set things up, and unfortunately the way she's treated here does go on to affect the next film. The closest Far From Home gets is her working at the feast shelter now, but just like MJ's line about not getting close to people, it's nothing of substance. There's no conversation about it. There's no exploring why she works at Feast and what helping the people of the city means to her. You technically, from a writing level, could glean like, oh yeah, May has a strong desire to help the less fortunate or something like that. But when that's all that the character has in this entire movie, it's nothing meaningful. There's nothing to it. If she had just started working at Feast in No Way Home instead of Far From Home, it would have made no difference to her character in that film because it doesn't inform her character in this one. I did mention a few production things already, but generally, much of what was true about Homecoming still applies here. The movie overall doesn't look great. A lot of bad green screen, just like before, more wonky CG, the Iron Spider suit looks worse than it did in Infinity War. Other than the main illusion scene, like I already talked about, a lot of the action is very meh. At least in Homecoming it was tangible, he was fighting physical guys and crooks on the street, but he spends half this movie fighting the elementals, which in universe are fake, but on the screen it's just Spider-Man fighting big CG goop monsters. It's not exciting, it's not cool, and there's just not much to any of this action. A lot of my cinematography comments from the previous film still apply too, mostly shot in a very standard, uninteresting way. Similar to Homecoming, there are a few cool moments, a neat cut or two, the camera actually moves in a dynamic way in an action scene once or twice. Production-wise, I do think it's an improvement, but only a slight one, and for the most part, still nothing that really wows me. There is at least a web-swinging scene of Spider-Man in New York at the end of the movie. That's neat. And this is what I was talking about in Homecoming, where it's a new version of Spider-Man swinging that establishes its own identity, where he's using his phone and he's taking pictures. Now, do I think this is presenting Spider-Man in as cool or as interesting a way as the other swinging renditions? No, but it's at least giving us him swinging in a new style in New York, so that's fine. The score is much of the same as well from Homecoming, where it works. It continues to fit a more lighthearted and whimsical Spider-Man. I do actually appreciate how there's slightly different variations of the main theme depending on what country or city their characters are currently in. That's super neat, but like the writing of the character in the film, the score still lacks a more impactful punch that would help me get a little bit more invested in this Peter Parker. Also, it's super weird that the identity reveal is a post-credit scene. Why isn't it just the end of the movie? Post-credit scenes are supposed to be fun little optional things that work as a tease or something coming up in the future. They shouldn't be essential viewing, especially for something as major as this, that's essentially the entire catalyst for the next movie's plot. That's about all I've got on Far From Home. A bad movie. It completely falls apart through its plot and character writing for Peter. It doesn't make any attempt to characterize the supporting cast in a meaningful way. It continues to fall into the MCU production trappings with its visual effects and camera work. And worst of all, it's just so clear in what its priorities are. First and foremost, it wanted to be funny, lighthearted, and whimsical, and do the absolute bare minimum when it comes to telling a compelling Spider-Man story that explores the character and his relationships. And unfortunately, this movie being what it was, did go on to hurt this trilogy as a whole in the long run. Spider-Man No Way Home. What a crazy, defining piece of Spider-Man history. This is a wild, wild movie, and the emotions leading up to its release, through initial rumors of a live-action Spider-Verse thing, to bringing back old actors, to the infamous set leaks, to fake toy leaks for some reason, and to the movie finally releasing. There's quite a bit to unpack, but is the movie good? Yes, kind of. This is the film I always point to in my life when I'm talking about movie analysis and criticism in general, because it's a great example of a movie that I do like. There are scenes I love, there's performances I love, there's writing and character drama I love, there are shots I love, there's no doubt a lot of good stuff in this movie. But also it's got a really bad plot and some unbelievably stupid character decisions. There's lots of rough-looking production elements, it's filled with conveniences and contrivances and multiversal magic that doesn't make any sense. So the question is, when weighing all these things together, how good is the movie as a whole, and how do you come to this conclusion? Let's get into it and all that this film has to offer. So after Far From Home, Peter's identity is revealed, and it's causing a whole bunch of problems for not only him, but his friends as well. So he goes to Doctor Strange for help, the spell goes wrong, all the villains show up, the Spider-Men show up, the spell at the end, you know the deal. And I'm not breaking new ground with this take, but a lot of No Way Home treats the character of Peter in a much more interesting and meaningful way than the previous two movies, and especially Far From Home. There's a lot about Peter's characterization that I quite like in this film. Although I don't think the identity reveal had a ton of weight behind it in Far From Home, due to all the stuff we discussed earlier, I do think the way the first 20 minutes or so of this movie treats it is pretty good. We see how it's affecting his daily life, and more importantly, how it's affecting his friends. I definitely could have used more of this in the film because it's quite a small part of the movie, but it's functional, it makes sense, it works. And I like the idea of Peter being motivated to fix this mistake in his life, primarily by his friends not getting into MIT, and their futures really being the ones affected by him being Spider-Man. It's a nice selfless thing for the character that also emphasizes his connection with them. Again, I blame Far From Home for not giving a bit more to his connection with MJ, for example, but I can't keep bringing that up constantly when discussing this movie. So, good setup. The first of many issues arises when Peter goes to Doctor Strange to see if there's any way he can help. So Strange begins casting a spell that will make the world forget Peter is Spider-Man. But Peter keeps trying to change the spell and it goes wrong, and instead of everyone in the world forgetting he's Spider-Man, it brought a bunch of people from across the multiverse to this Earth who do know that Peter is Spider-Man. Where to even start with that? Maybe with the fact that this is one of the worst ways to kick off a plot I have ever seen. For one, this is crazy out of character for Doctor Strange, who has a snarky demeanor but is very down to business and serious about his role as a sorcerer and protecting the universe. He knows the stakes of using magic and doing whatever it takes to protect the universe and multiverse, and he agrees to cast the spell that can go wrong so easily. Absolutely not. I don't think he would take this giant gamble just to help Peter and his friends get into college. And it'd be different if it seemed like the spell was safer, but the fact that it can go wrong by Peter just talking during it, there's no way Strange wouldn't have explained the spell or how it works in the slightest to Peter before they started doing it. Peter didn't know that it would work by everyone in the world forgetting his identity. Also, yeah, Peter just talking changes it, I guess, but you can change it a little, just not too much, because after he changed it 2 times, it seemed to be fine, but then the 3rd time it finally shattered. It was just that unstable. Can Strange start the spell over again with the correct parameters this time? Strange probably should have just canceled it when the spell started going wrong in the first place, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, but this spell had nothing to do with anything outside our universe. This spell got so unstable that it shattered past our world and reached into the multiverse? I know, dumb magic rules, whatever, but Peter and especially Strange are unforgivably stupid here. It's incredibly out of character for Doctor Strange, and honestly pretty in line with Far From Home in terms of Peter being really, really dumb. Also, Wong is also out of character for saying, just leave me out of it, I'm gonna leave, when he actually would say, no Strange, you're not gonna cast that spell, I'm Sorcerer Supreme now, let's see if we can figure something else out. Even with all those issues, I do like Peter's arc in this movie of really learning the responsibilities and sacrifice that come with being Spider-Man and channeling that loss into becoming a better and more responsible hero. We'll get more into that later, but I like that the problems he experiences in this story are kicked off here, by him trying to have his cake and eat it too, essentially. He's basically getting this insane way out from Doctor Strange, but that's not enough for him, and he still tries to get his ideal life pretty much. He still wants May, Ned, MJ, everyone he cares about to know. He's essentially trying to get around the consequences of the identity reveal by losing the bad stuff but keeping the good. Again, having his cake but eating it too. So I like that his arc is essentially kicked off by him trying to ignore and avoid the consequences, only for this to cause much worse ones that come back to bite him later. A neat idea. I just wish it wasn't at the expense of making him a complete moron. He comes across as so stupid in this scene. There's clearly something going wrong with the spell as he keeps talking, but no, he continues to blabber and make the spell super unstable. Another part of Peter's characterization I do like is the central conflict of the movie, being that 4 of these 5 villains that are brought into the MCU are destined to die when sent back, and Peter doesn't accept this and tries to figure out a way to help them and maybe change their fate. And I like this idea because again, it's a very in-character, selfless thing for Spider-Man to do. He doesn't kill, and being in a situation where he's essentially sending these 4 people to their deaths forces him to act on his beliefs. I also like that May is the one that really encourages him to do this, and reminds him of his responsibility to help people no matter the cost. Now, as noble as this is, I'm not sure this would really work. I mean, for Green Goblin, Lizard, and Electro, it'd probably save them, but Doc Ock is still going to get back to Spider-Man 2 right where he came from and have to destroy the machine. So that all turns out the same, he still dies a hero, whatever. And just like the setup for the story, I love the idea of what it's doing for Peter's character, but again, the way it's executed is so stupid. Peter takes these 5 villains who he doesn't know anything about, most of which have just tried to kill him and clearly have these destructive, dangerous abilities. Green Goblin was killing people on the bridge. He takes these people to Happy's apartment in the middle of New York with his closest loved one there. This is once again ridiculously stupid for Peter. Why doesn't he take them out of the cells one at a time to cure them? Why doesn't he bring the Fabricator to the dungeon? He needs Norman's help to make the cures, so let him out, you two work on the tech for each villain one at a time. And the fact that he doesn't tell May to go somewhere else, not at Happy's apartment, until this is done, or the fact that Lizard wanted to stay in the truck and they're just like, oh, that's completely fine.
Where's Connors? He told me he wants to stay in the truck. Okay.
We'll just leave him there unsupervised. That's so stupid. Just leave him at the prison and go get him when it's time to cure him. Peter's putting so many people in danger by doing this. Strange is still trapped in the mirror dimension. It's not like you have to worry about him coming back to the dungeon for now. Just such a lazy and legitimately stupid way to get the plot where it needs to go. It's also probably worth noting that the spell that brought them here is pretty random in terms of how it works as far as timing, because Green Goblin, Doc Ock, and Electro were all taken sometime after they discovered Peter was Spider-Man, but also before their deaths. Meanwhile, Sandman was taken from who knows how long after he discovered Peter's secret, and Toby and Andrew, of course, are just like 10 to 15 years after we last saw them. Obviously, it's for the story, everyone knows why it was done this way. Not really a huge complaint, but it is worth pointing out that it's pretty arbitrary and convenient that it worked out the way it did. Let's also hit on the villains of the movie. Lizard is here and probably the worst one. He's still somewhat in character, I guess, but the goofy factor has been turned up for sure. I do like some of the jokes that make fun of him and just how stupid his plan was in the first Amazing Spider-Man film.
You know I can give you a real makeover.
Let me guess. Into a lizard?
Exactly.
You two just shut up.
I think that's generally okay because it was ridiculous in that movie, and someone from his universe like Max making fun of it, I think is fitting. But there's also lines that just feel so MCU-esque, and to hear them coming out of Lizard's mouth is weird for sure. But that applies to other lines in this film as well that are just like, why'd you do that? Come on.
I'm sorry, what was your name again?
Dr. Otto Octavius.
Wait, no, seriously, what's your actual name?
No way, that's his girlfriend. No way.
You know, I know a couple of magic words myself, starting with the word please.
Please, Scooby-Doo this shit.
But yeah, Lizard is definitely the worst of the returning villains, but he was never good and is easily the worst part of the first Amazing Spider-Man film too. I will say it's weird they didn't take this opportunity to improve his design a little. It's widely agreed that the design of Lizard is gross and doesn't really look like the character. Why not give him a snout and a lab coat and purple pants when they completely changed Electro to improve his design? Speaking of Electro, it's been said, but he is an improvement for sure over his last version, and his personality has completely shifted, and no one's complaining because now Jamie Foxx actually gets to have some fun with the role and be charismatic instead of whatever performance he gave before. And I like Jamie Foxx. This is about all I could ever want from a pretty basic Electro on the big screen, so he works. He just wants power and wants to stay in the new world with the Stark tech and all this crazy new electricity. Makes sense in character. Personality isn't really consistent, which one could say is technically a problem, but I don't really care. You probably don't care, because no one wanted blue Jamie Foxx back. Sandman also returns, and I like that when he first shows up, it is helping Spider-Man, something he would do after their conversation at the end of Spider-Man 3. However, Sandman's weird because he's the only one of the 5 villains that wants to go home, because he's not about to die, he just cares about Penny and wants to get home. Cool, consistent, also makes sense. But after Goblin attacks, it doesn't make sense why he's not actively trying to help Spider-Man. There's a lot of chaos in this scene, a lot of characters to keep track of, and a lot of stuff that doesn't really make sense if you think about it for more than a second. But Sandman during this scene just creates a sandstorm and then bails. He should be thinking, I need to help Spider-Man because he's my only chance of getting home. He doesn't care about the other villains in the slightest or if they die. And in this scene, if Goblin kills Spider-Man, then maybe these people he doesn't know will press the button, but he wouldn't rely on that. He needs to get home. It's just so weird to me that he leaves to go, I don't know, hang out after the apartment fight until they get the call from Peter. And when we get to the final fight, the same thing applies. He yells at Peter to give him the box because he just wants to go home, and Electro tells him none of them are going home because he doesn't want to go home. That makes sense, but then Sandman continues to just create sandstorms and make life difficult for the Spider-Men and attack them.
Where's the box, Peter?
Flint, we can help everyone!
I don't care!
Even Toby Spider-Man, who he knows. It doesn't make sense why he doesn't just go up to the Spider-Men and say, I'll help you cure Electro and Lizard, and then we can find Goblin and we can all go home. It's not like he's actively going after the box in the fight either. He's just attacking because we needed an action scene fighting all the villains. It's really, really dumb. And although I do like Sandman, and I like Thomas Hayden Church as that character, they're clearly having to make some leaps in order for him to be an antagonist in the movie. Next is Doc Ock, who thankfully is treated pretty well. He acts in character for the most part, Alfred Molina is still really fun as the villain for the first part of the movie, and gives a quite subdued but compelling performance as Otto in the last act. There's really not too much to discuss other than the performance is great, he acts appropriately, and he saves the Spider-Man from Electro. I don't know why he leaves during the condo fight. Just like Sandman, the use of all the villains during the Goblin attack is horrible, but whatever. And finally, the big one, Green Goblin. He is phenomenal. Willem Dafoe is still so good as this character that could easily come across as cringe and like he's trying too hard, but he's able to pull off the maniacal psychopath that the Green Goblin is and capture the spirit of that character still over 20 years later in a way I'm not sure we'll ever see again. Goblin isn't actually on screen that much overall, but he's still able to be a menacing, legitimately physical threat to Peter in a way we haven't seen in these movies yet. Vulture beat him up a little, but their fight wasn't much, and he did attack Thanos briefly, but this is the first time we see Peter actually get bested physically, hand to hand, and it's not even close. And Goblin's got a smile on his face the entire time. I also love so much of his dialogue in this movie. He's got some really memorable and quotable lines that inform his character and this really solid hero-villain dynamic he has with Tom.
Gods don't have to choose. We take. Strong enough to have it all. Too weak to take it!
Peter, Peter, Peter. No good deed goes unpunished. You can thank me later.
Again, Willem Dafoe's delivery of these lines really makes it, and I love presenting Goblin as the moral antithesis to Aunt May. He believes these abilities make them gods who are better than everyone else. He's the epitome of immorality, and is here in this new world to wreak havoc and be an evil presence. He's such a great classic villain, which is becoming more of a rarity these days, as everyone feels the need to present their antagonists as sympathetic or misunderstood. He's a great foil to Spider-Man and his mission of trying to uphold May's morals by helping the villains and later by not killing Goblin. So overall, yeah, he's one of the best MCU villains now, which is crazy because he really isn't in this film that much, but he made such a big impact and he just rocks this Peter Parker's world, and it makes for some crazy engaging intense scenes. I will say one thing that kind of stands out is that Norman seems a little too unlike himself when he first shows up in the MCU. Yes, he would be scared in a new world, but Norman is still a pretty ruthless businessman who, depending on when in Spider-Man 1 he was taken, I don't think should be acting as submissive and cowardly as he does. Regardless, Goblin kills May in a scene that I think is quite good. A killer performance by Tom and Marissa Tomei. I like the kind of fake out where she thinks she's okay at first, and it's a very emotional moment between the two. I think killing May makes a lot of sense in this movie, and as a character, she's treated pretty well here. I don't think it builds off the previous film well at all in terms of her character, but for this movie individually, yeah, I love her being Peter's moral center pretty much. And the whole premise of Peter listening to her and helping the villains, but she pays the price for it, and is still adamant they made the right choice because it's the responsible thing to do, that's great. After this, the other Spider-Men are introduced, and I like them coming in a very subdued and close to the ground setting of a neighborhood home. I think you could have done it with triumphant music playing in the middle of an action scene, but this works perfectly well for how they're used in this film. They just walk through with slight hints of their themes playing, and they're used as well-written, meaningful supporting characters first, and action figures that battle second. They help lift Peter up at his low point and instill this idea of May's sacrifice meaning something, and him needing to live his life according to the morals that she died for. And this rooftop scene really is the make or break moment of this film, meaning this movie would be unforgivable if it really ruined the previous Spider-Man. And I was convinced it would. When I heard they were rumored to be in this movie years ago, I was worried. And somehow they both were written extremely well, and a lot of care was taken to make sure they act in character. The rooftop scene is executed perfectly, with both previous Peters using their shared but also different life experiences to emphasize and connect with this Peter who's just lost everything. They of course reinforce the great power, great responsibility thing shared between all of them, but Toby recalls his experience of Uncle Ben's killer dying, and Andrew recalls how he felt and acted after Gwen died, and how they've both experienced that vengeance doesn't solve anything, but in different ways. It's just a very intelligent use of all three of those characters' histories and what unites them all as Spider-Man, but also leans into their differences and how that informs their characters too. And they continue to do this in the rest of the film, but with a bit more fun. All three actors just have such great chemistry with each other, and again, using the three of them to play off each other and reveal enough of their histories since their movies ended, but leaving it open enough where you can still guess on some details and not know everything, I think it's well done. There's all the fun fan service stuff like talking about their webbing and their villains. Their personalities are all intact, with Tobey acting as goofy, genuine, and kind-hearted as his Peter ever did, and Andrew's Peter being more expressive and remorseful here. I love their themes really playing in full, not during an action moment, but when they're empathizing and just talking with their villains. That's a really nice touch. The Andrew saving MJ scene, of course, is an obvious but still fitting moment where he gets the chance to make up for not saving Gwen, and it's just played really well. Tobey getting in the way of Peter killing Goblin but not needing to say anything, just reminding him of something he already knows. Again, another great moment. And just the idea of these Peters using their life experiences and lessons to help better the life and character of this Peter, I could go on. But point being, this film nailed these characters with one very weird exception.
Do you have a best friend too?
He died in my arms after he tried to kill me. It's heartbreaking.
I know this line is written so Ned can play off of it as a joke, but I've always kind of disliked it because Peter wouldn't say this. He wouldn't be like, oh yeah, Harry, my friend who tried to kill me, when his main lasting memory of him would be how he gave his life saving MJ and Peter, and what a good friend he is. That's the one moment with Tobey and Andrew returning that seems a little weird. Other than that, they all act perfectly with each other, and it really is the ultimate dream for any Spider-Man fan. And the whole Marvel multiverse bringing back old actors thing still hasn't been done even close to as well as this in Doctor Strange, Deadpool, really anything since. So yeah, Peter benefits greatly from being able to interact and learn from the other two Spider-Men. And it's just so nice finally seeing this Spider-Man in a way you can take a bit more seriously. It feels like he's grown up from when we met him in Civil War, and actually seeing some anger and real, dramatic, meaningful emotion from him that's rooted in consequences of his decisions, it's perfect. And this idea of the sacrifice to be Spider-Man is hit home even further due to the spell and everyone forgetting who Peter is. And this is another beat that relies on Peter's relationships being built up in the previous two movies. I don't think I've mentioned MJ much yet in this film, but again, she's present, and her and Peter's relationship is fine here. I already mentioned how much more could have and should have been done to create a little bit more depth to the relationship, but as it's presented in this movie, I mean, I buy it, it works in broad strokes, I guess. It is pretty heartbreaking when the spell happens because we do care a lot about Peter by this point, and we've seen his time with Ned and MJ, but still, most of the emotion of the scene is definitely drawn from the performances as opposed to the loss of MJ and Peter's relationship. It works, but like many things, I wish Far From Home had done more work, and then the romantic relationship being erased here could have hit even harder. There are of course countless questions to be asked in terms of how this spell even works because it makes no sense. What do the Avengers remember about Spider-Man now? Is it just that he is Spider-Man and not his actual identity? I mean, that would have to pretty significantly alter and create new memories to an extent for so many people. Or what about the physical evidence? All the documents about Peter being arrested and charged for the crimes in the beginning, do those just disappear? It doesn't make sense, everyone knows it. More of this plot being whack. But at the end of the film, Peter's arc really comes full circle with the coffee shop scene and final swing. This is legitimately one of the best Spider-Man scenes in a film. It is the full embodiment of his arc, accepting the responsibility and sacrifice that comes with being Spider-Man and channeling that loss into something good. It's just such a great moment where MJ moves her hair and the bandage is a reminder of how those close to Peter will get hurt.
You okay?
Doesn't really hurt anymore.
And I love that "it doesn't really hurt anymore" line, referring to how her life without Spider-Man in it will be less dangerous and probably have less hurt. And it really just hit that idea home for Peter. He makes the tough, selfless choice to keep MJ safe and sacrifice his own happiness. This is good writing and so emblematic of the character, combined with going into his rundown apartment, sewing his own suit for the first time, and leaping out into the snow. And I love the way the screenplay puts it. Liberated from having to juggle two lives, Peter Parker is no more, but Spider-Man lives on. These last couple scenes really are just a dream come true, and there's such a bittersweet and very different vibe to this last portion of the film that is brand new to this version of the character. Not only writing, but visually too. The very brief shot of Peter walking down the snowy street looks like it's from a completely different movie. I love the shimmering of the blue on his suit in the snowy night sky. There's just such a tone to this ending that I completely adore, and it's a perfect ending to this film and to his character. I love it. We'll talk more about this ending in terms of MCU Spider-Man as a whole when we discuss him shortly. I've of course got to bring up some production stuff one more time, just because this has some of the best of the trilogy, but also some of the worst. This movie, just like the previous two, has a lot of bad green screen. Yeah, nothing new, I know. I would specifically blame the pandemic, but Far From Home also had that problem, so whatever. Aside from the bad green screen, this movie just has some pretty disgusting looking scenes in it, like the bridge fight, which just looks horribly lit for some reason, so fake. It makes the Iron Spider suit look worse than it ever has. And if you were on Spider-Man Twitter when this movie came out, you may have seen it get ripped to shreds for its visuals. Lots of bad CG objects and tracking and lighting, and it's even more apparent when you're bringing in these characters that were previously helmed by directors that made them look good. And I'm not going to harp on it too much, but yeah, obviously, all of the returning characters look worse. Thankfully, Goblin CG after this gross scene right here is pretty solid. I love his design change allowing Willem Dafoe to emote even more. But Doc Ock looks pretty rough for parts of the bridge fight. Lizard looks horribly fake pretty much consistently. Somehow the CG on him is worse than it was nearly 10 years ago. And Electro and Sandman are just fine. If they couldn't get Thomas Hayden Church in person for pandemic reasons, that's fine, not their fault. But the way in which all of these villains are presented clearly just isn't as visually impressive as before. The action with them just isn't as good. The Electro fights looked much better in Amazing Spider-Man 2, and I think most people would just admit that Jon Watts and his DP don't seem to have as keen or creative of a visual eye as someone like Sam Raimi or Mark Webb or their DPs. Which is fine, it doesn't make them horrible movies, but it does kind of suck to see these characters you love presented on a really cheap looking green screen or with really rough looking CGI. I will say this film easily has the best action of the three. The condo fight is really awesome. Again, seeing an actual choreographed physical fight for this Peter is great, with them flying through floors and just using this setting in a somewhat interesting way. It's weird that the apartment building is completely abandoned, I guess, from whatever we see, but whatever. The Doctor Strange mirror dimension fight is also neat from a visual level, even if I still don't really understand how he beat him with geometry. And the final fight is solid enough. I do wish there were a few less cuts in it, but no huge issues for me. The other Spider-Men do suffer visually compared to their previous appearances, like we were just talking about with the villains. I actually think Andrew looks pretty good most of the time, except for when he saves MJ. That looks horrible, like unforgivably bad, and almost takes away from an otherwise excellent moment. But Toby, most of the time in the final fight, just doesn't look real or right in the slightest. The lighting on his model is much worse than every single time he was on screen in his movies, and it's pretty distracting and kind of hard to see because this whole fight is just dark and gross to look at. It's visually a pretty drab look for the big climactic action set piece, and seeing these dark blurry CG models jump around doesn't make for as cool of an action scene as it should. When we get to the big moment of the three Spider-Men swinging, don't get me wrong, it's cool, obviously, I like it, I was pretty excited in the theater, and as it stands in the movie, it's fine. But do I wish the first time this historic huge event happened, it didn't look like this? Of course. I just don't think the nighttime Statue of Liberty construction setting was the best choice to place this finale. And it sucks to see because this moment should be magical, and it's neat as it is, but could've and should've looked so much better. However, this is the first movie in the trilogy that I think really has some spice and effort put into some of its shot choices and camera work. I love the wonder at the beginning in Peter's apartment, invoking the desperate franticness of his identity being out there. I already mentioned the last scene or two, but once again they look great, especially from a lighting standpoint. The tracking, almost snorri cam shot of Peter's spider sense going off and trying to track down the cause is excellent. That's just a really new, creative, but still visually interesting way to show off the spider sense. The beautiful shot of Peter in the rain illuminated by the giant screen of Jonah, I love it because it's stylized, it's comic booky, it's not trying to be realistically lit, it's trying to reflect Peter's mental state of complete anguish and being hit over the head with the guilt of May's death. It's awesome, and I feel like this is the movie where Jon Watts either felt more confident or maybe he was just more experienced now. Either way, this is the only time where I feel that some of a unique voice starts to poke through, and it's cool to see. I also love how long the camera lingers on each of the Spider-Men during the rooftop scene, not cutting around too much and really just letting the focus be on these characters, the writing, and the performances. Also, for the first time this trilogy, I really like the score. Many of the tracks highlight the dramatic moments quite well, like after May's death and Peter saying goodbye. We also finally get a rendition of his theme in the final swing that has a bit more power behind it, a larger sense of scale. It invokes a more triumphant, empowering feeling like I've been talking about, as opposed to the whimsical one the previous themes were going for. It's slowed down a bit, and it fits the final swing quite well. And I think that'll do it on No Way Home. And it's such a difficult movie to judge. It's insane to me how this has some of the best Spider-Man scenes ever put to film. It's this incredible cinematic event of all three Spider-Men hanging out, meaningfully adding to each other's characters in well-written, appropriate ways. It's got a scene that perfectly embodies a major conflict of the Spider-Man character. It has scenes with emotional weight, it's got great performances, it's got a good villain, a standout action scene, and that's all awesome. But it also has a really bad plot, some rough dialogue, lots of mediocre VFX, and really stupid character actions and contrived moments. So after all of that, what do you say? When analyzing film, how do you say if this movie's good when the highs are so high and the lows so low? Well, that is up to you, but I usually lean towards the character writing and themes being a bit more meaningful to me than plot issues. They still matter, and the plot is still super flawed here, but I think there's too much good character stuff going on to ignore. The fact that the coffee shop scene is in the same film as the spell going wrong is crazy to me. But that's it, and I do like this movie. I think it's pretty good. Obviously flawed, but lots of great stuff in there. And like I said at the beginning, this is still my go-to example of a film that kills it with its characters for the most part, has a horrible plot, and still barely scrapes by as a mostly good movie. Those are the three movies. So overall, how are these as a film trilogy and as our newest big-budget film adaptation of Spider-Man? As a trilogy, it's crazy uneven. A solid intro followed by a dreadful sequel, concluded with a good but heavily flawed finale. It's hard to judge as a whole, but if someone asks me generally what I think of MCU Spider-Man today, my tone usually leans more negative than positive, because I'm just not crazy about how they chose to adapt Spider-Man as a character in this trilogy. The idea is you're gonna tell this story of a young, high school Peter Parker growing up in the MCU and growing as the hero Spider-Man, and Homecoming really embodies this idea, and by the end of that film, it's clear that he has a much better sense of identity and is on his way to becoming more of the Spider-Man we know and love. I will say, especially in the last decade or so, the idea of a hero growing into a more recognizable and iconic version of themselves seems to be pretty common, whether they have to earn their costume or begin to take on their more distinct character traits. And like everything, this can be done well and it can be done poorly. I think The Batman really excels at this, where it's a Bruce Wayne early in his vigilante career still learning the best way to be Batman. He still maintains many of his Batman traits, but he hasn't figured out the best way to help the people of Gotham yet. He hasn't figured out how to leverage his Bruce Wayne identity to help enact change in the city. And the movie covers Bruce's arc of learning to embody a sense of hope as opposed to vengeance in the citizens of Gotham. And it's clear he'll continue to grow in the future. And that's the point of this, right? People don't stop growing and changing after a story is told or after an arc is complete. They'll continue to evolve, and many superhero trilogies show their characters evolving based on new circumstances and stories told. Whether it's Steve's change from Captain America 1 to 3, where he grows more disillusioned with institutions and really embraces staying true to his personal values and relationships, or even Peter in the Raimi trilogy growing into an adult that understands the weight of his responsibility as Spider-Man and how to balance his two lives, maintain his relationships, and learn to forgive others and himself. So then why do so many people take issue with how MCU Peter is characterized? Well, a lot of it we touched on, but I want to bring up one of the big ones that I haven't really dived into yet. Why does Spider-Man do what he does? We discussed it at the beginning, but it's the classic origin we all know. And we all know it because it works, it's effective, and I would argue that it's integral to the character and his motivation. You can have a Spider-Man without the normal Uncle Ben origin, but you better replace Peter's motivation with something just as interesting and thematically poignant to the character. And MCU Spider-Man is super weird about this, because Civil War clearly implies some sort of event has happened that motivated this Peter Parker to be Spider-Man. He tells Tony this. Technically, I guess there doesn't have to be this kind of origin for a Spider-Man. You could just have a Peter Parker that swings around and fights crime because it's the right thing to do, but that is infinitely less interesting, layered, relatable, and I just think so much worse than the actual origin of the character. Even though Homecoming and Far From Home are about Peter learning to be his own hero and forging his own identity, there still needs to be that intrinsic motivation. When Peter does what he does in Homecoming, yeah, he's trying to prove himself as a hero, but why is he Spider-Man? If you don't know the origin, then you really have no idea. And by the time we get to this movie, actually focused on the character of Peter in Homecoming, then the quick line in Civil War isn't enough. There's got to be more. Even if the movie isn't about his origin, it still matters. It's still integral to the character. It is the fundamental basis of his worldview and morality. That's a part of the Peter Parker character that needs to be present in one way or another. And when we're talking about adaptation, this is another prime example. The origin of Spider-Man is something that is necessary to adapting the character. Yeah, I still think Homecoming is a pretty good movie, but is Peter Parker doing his Spider-Man thing in that movie missing something by his intrinsic motivation being completely absent? I think so. If I'm watching Homecoming with a friend who doesn't know the origin, and I ask them, why do you think Peter Parker even became Spider-Man? Maybe they'll try and reference his line in Civil War if they even remember that, but more than likely they'll be like, I don't know, because it's the right thing to do, maybe? And that's a problem. That's crazy for the character of Spider-Man to be presented like that in his popular brand new film series. It's doing a disservice to the character. There are multiple ways that Homecoming, or even Far From Home, could have worked in some kind of real origin for the character. And I know everyone says, but that's the point, the whole trilogy is his origin. Kind of a cool idea, and yes, you can have a trilogy where by the end you've got the Spider-Man you know and love, which is what they did, but now you've got 2.5 movies of Spider-Man being characterized in a way that's more of a prototype version of the character. And it just creates such a weird lack of direction for this trilogy, where it feels like the big Uncle Ben thing happened before Civil War, and then Peter just keeps regressing in each of his solo movies. It's weird that his first instinct in No Way Home is to send the villains back where they came from and say that it's not his problem, when after Civil War, he should know he has a responsibility to help them without Aunt May having to encourage him. The Civil War moment is so weird now because they even acknowledge that Peter already knows it in No Way Home when the whole May thing happens, but he hasn't acted like he knows it. The line from Civil War is still super vague. Also, it's not clear how May's death is really communicating something different than the idea from Civil War, other than just really hitting it home. I feel like it should have been elaborated on or expanded on a little more, since this Peter has seemingly already gone through that experience, or at least a comparable one, to his classic origin. Again, I like how May is used in the context of the No Way Home film, but there's such an unevenness to Peter in the MCU. And I'm sure a lot of it is production reasons that bled into the writing. I'm sure the plan was always for the third movie to end with more dramatic stakes and wait for this version of Peter, and maybe more closely resemble the actual character. But they went so far in that direction with the great power, great responsibility moment, with him being completely alone, that it does feel like an abrupt course correct in a sense. Again, I think it works generally for that film, but there's a part of me that can't shake the fact that this trilogy just really lacked direction for Peter's character. For the vast majority of this Spider-Man's time on screen, he's lacking intrinsic motivation that we know anything about. His two villains have been motivated by Tony Stark or an idea he represented. He's swinging around with fancy Stark tech suits, and his arcs have used Tony or the Avengers as a way to show his growth. And that sucks because it's a waste of the character. And in my opinion, I just don't like such a heavy focus on Spider-Man having to learn to forge his own identity. Although I think it works for Homecoming and relatively makes sense, and it's not a problem in that movie, that's just not an arc that I think the character of Spider-Man needs to go on. That's not really taking advantage of what makes Spider-Man special. And it sucks to see Spider-Man spend so much of his screen time as this pretty goofy, fairly incompetent kid who's just such a watered-down adaptation of the character that we like. And aside from the villains, this applies to most parts and characters of the Spider-Man mythos and world too. You've got what should be one of his most integral relationships being with Aunt May. It was established well enough in Homecoming, absolutely wasted in Far From Home, and pretty well done in No Way Home, but the connective tissue of the second movie is missing. Same thing applies to MJ, and whether it's due to corporate nonsense where they're not allowed to make a comic accurate version of the character or whatever, you can still create a layered, interesting character. There's a reason everyone loves Mary Jane and Peter together. MJ as this girl who, due to her upbringing, develops this outgoing and carefree persona that isn't held down by Harry or Peter or Flash. She's a free spirit until she begins to mature and put more value in her personal relationships, and is hit with the truth of reality when Gwen dies, who has this friendship and interesting conversations with other supporting cast members like Betty Brant or Robbie. She understands and is able to connect with Peter in a way that no one else can. They adapt that interesting character to be a girl with a kind of fun personality to watch, but she's got nothing that's explored, no depth. We get the vaguest hints, but she's a nothing burger, which is a waste when adapting MJ, the love interest of Peter Parker. This is a version of Spider-Man that feels really afraid to dive into the personal drama between Peter and the people in his life. You don't have to adapt the Daily Bugle and its staff, but you better add something really new and exciting that contributes as much to the Spider-Man mythos. We already talked about how Flash was adapted. Again, Ned is fine, but could have been so much more. There's just so many decisions that were made for this version of the character that aren't as interesting and don't lean into as much of what makes the character worth watching and worth experiencing. In fact, some of the decisions, especially in Far From Home, lean in the opposite direction of what the character is. Not to say comic accurate equals good, because comic accuracy can also mean a whole wide range of things depending on who you're talking to, but it comes down to the question of when you're adapting something, you need to include the elements of the original that are the reason you're even adapting it in the first place. Not just because Spider-Man's a big IP and one of the most popular characters on the planet, and we're Sony and we own the film rights, we're going to keep churning out movies. If you're adapting it and you're writing that character, you're responsible for adapting the parts of that character that make the character what they are. If you're telling a Spider-Man story, adapt the character in a way that fits your universe, but also stays true to the spirit of what the character is, and especially what the character represents. There is something missed by not having a love interest with some depth, by not having a Daily Bugle supporting cast, by not having meaningful drama and social consequences for Peter and the people in his life, by not having Peter relate to the everyman who's dealing with financial troubles, by having villains so closely tied to Tony Stark, and by having crazy technology and super suits. All of that is what they replaced the core Spider-Man mythos with. And yes, by the end of No Way Home, we have made it to a more traditional Spider-Man we all know, in a dingy apartment with meaningful intrinsic motivation that we've seen with a handmade suit. We're there. But was it really worth it to have nearly all of the screen time with this Spider-Man be a version of the character that didn't resemble Spider-Man in many of the meaningful ways? I wouldn't say so. One of the reasons the ending of No Way Home hits hard is because Peter had all the fancy tech, he had all the connections, he knew everyone, and it's completely stripped away by the end. But did he really need to go through that journey of completely losing everything that it's weird he even had in the first place for us to finally get a recognizable Spider-Man? I wouldn't say so. And for those reasons, it's a weird trilogy, and at the end of the day, we have nearly 3 full movies of a version of Spider-Man that is lacking much of the reason people love Spider-Man, and that's really unfortunate. To try and bring this to a close, I do appreciate things about this trilogy. Tom Holland has been great since day one, and I so wish he had better material to work with. There's occasional good bits of writing and a solid start for the character in Homecoming, even if it's not how I'd like to see Spider-Man adapted for the widest audience possible. But unfortunately, Far From Home is pretty bad on most fronts, and No Way Home contains some of the best Spider-Man scenes put to film, but also some abysmal writing. It's all over the place, but the way Spider-Man's presented in these movies matters because these films are huge, and exposing general audiences to the new, most well-known version of this character matters. And I feel like they didn't lean into what makes the character and his supporting world great, why people like him. As films themselves, Homecoming is good, Far From Home is bad, and No Way Home is a kind of cool mess of a movie. Regardless, they really do have the perfect setup now for a more traditional Spider-Man story that is able to give a lot of the fans what they want. Knowing Sony, they'll probably screw it up, but we'll just have to wait and see. And maybe if they end up doing that right, people will begin to appreciate the MCU trilogy for the little unique adaptation that it was. As it stands, not a huge fan myself, but at the very least, they are still Spider-Man films, and hopefully they inspired at least a few people to pick up some comics or some shows or other movies and see what the character is all about. Thank you all for watching.